Thank you all for joining us today. For those that don't know me, I'm Tom Johnson. I'm the Deputy CEO at Council of Homeless Persons, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining from Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the land was never ceded. Welcome to the first of CHP's Homelessness Week events on this Homelessness Week, which we're talking about homelessness action now. I wouldn't be a good host if I didn't plug our other two Homelessness Week events. You can join us tomorrow on a lived experience webinar, and on Thursday join us in person as we launch the witty workforce analysis report at RMIT. You can go to our CHP website to find out more information and register for those events. And now brings us to our exciting day today. Today's webinar, Housing First, Learnings from Europe. And to tell us more, I'll hand over to Alison, who's our facilitator for today. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks, Tom. Welcome, everybody. Glad you could make it along to this lunchtime session for Homelessness Week. And just so everyone knows, the session is being recorded and it will be posted to the CHP channel on YouTube for future reference. So my name's Alison Fraser. I'm the lead practitioner for Housing First here at CHP. And today we're really fortunate to be hosting a presentation by the inaugural Jenny Smith Scholar, who is Charlotte, who will be sharing some key insights from her travels to Housing First organisations in Europe and the UK in 2023. Welcome, Charlotte. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself first?
Okay, thanks, Alison, and thanks, Tom. My name is Charlotte. I use she, her pronouns. And in my work context, I am a program coordinator of an outreach case management team filled with case managers who do fantastic work and fantastically privileged work in supporting people in accessing their right to housing and to continue support in making that housing a home. I'm one of the National Housing First trainers, which means I provide training on the Housing First principles. I'm a member of the National Housing First Community of Practice, as well as the local community of practice here in Victoria. And as you've mentioned, I'm the very fortunate recipient of the 2023 Jenny Smith Housing First Scholarship, and I'm grateful to have yours and everyone's time here for this webinar.
Thanks, Charlotte. So I'll just give everyone a quick outline of today's session. I'm going to begin with a few slides to provide a quick overview of Housing First, but I'm going to assume that everyone on the call knows a bit about Housing First and is a fan. So we won't labour the point. And then Charlotte will dive into her presentation. Then at the end, I'm going to give some further details about the Jenny Smith Scholarship for 2024, which is just open for applications. And you can see that on the CHP website. So I really hope that today's presentation inspires you to think about how you might be able to develop an application for the scholarship or encourage someone you know to do so. And I'd also like to acknowledge Lucas, who is our behind the scenes man who's advancing the slides. So thanks, Lucas. If we can go to slide 2, thank you. So what is Housing First? The definition offered by Homelessness Australia is that Housing First is an international model for housing and supporting people who have experienced long-term and recurring homelessness and who face a range of complex challenges. It's widely accepted to have originated in New York in 1992 with the Pathways to Housing program run by Sam Semberis. And as such, it's worth noting that Housing First essentially came from the mental health sector, where it was a bit of a paradigm shift and designed to house and support people who had severe and enduring mental illness and who were trapped in prolonged cycles of rough sleeping and hospitalisations. These people would fail to qualify for programs that had a lot of conditions attached, or if they managed to get in, they would often fall at the first hurdle and end up back on the streets. So the core philosophy of Housing First is to remove housing readiness barriers by bringing vulnerable individuals directly into long-term secure and affordable housing as the foundation for multidisciplinary support and long-term recovery. And it's been shown to be cost-effective, boosting housing placement and retention rates compared to traditional approaches. So once the model has been in place and adapted internationally for a few years, people realise that we need some standardised principles in response to concern that adaptation and replication of Housing First was starting to dilute the effectiveness of the model. And this can lead to perceptions of failure and also contribute to a lack of clarity about what the Housing First model actually is. So based on a comprehensive review of evidence and research, a set of Housing First principles has been developed and adopted across the United States, Canada, Europe and England. And indeed in Australia, 8 Housing First principles have been developed for our context to promote and define the implementation of Housing First Australia-wide and address the program drift that can happen as the model gets picked up and implemented differently in different places. So the main message here is that the higher the adherence to the principles, and that's called model fidelity, the better the outcomes for people in the Housing First program. More details on the Housing First principles are available. You can either go to the Homelessness Australia website. Lucas is going to put the link in the chat. And also there's fabulous webinars on the CHP YouTube channel from our National Housing First trainers. And we'll also put that link there for you to access. But just to quickly step through the principles, first one, people have the right to a home. So this is about immediate rapid access to a permanent self-contained home that meets people's social and cultural needs. Second principle, housing and support are separated. The provision of support and tenancy, of course, is closely connected, but it must be functionally separated with continued tenancy not contingent on the acceptance of support. Third principle is flexible support for as long as is needed. This one's a little elusive, of course. Ideally, there's no end date to support because we recognise chronic homelessness is not a diagnosis, it's actually a prognosis, and people remain vulnerable to homelessness even when housed. So low caseloads give the ability for support to flex up and down so that people can re-engage after exit even if they need to. Fourth principle is choice and self-determination. We know this is key to success and healing trauma for people who have experienced multiple service system failures over their lifetime. Fifth principle, active engagement without coercion. So the onus is squarely on the worker to creatively invite and encourage people to engage with support. Social and community inclusion, of course, is essential to helping people rebuild a sense of self and belonging in the world when they've spent so long excluded and marginalised. Seventh principle is recovery-oriented practice, familiar to everyone, I think, supporting a recovery journey in a way that is unique and appropriate to each individual, and with the worker holding hope and allowing the dignity of risk. The final principle is another familiar one, a harm reduction approach in which we proactively support people to reduce the negative impact of potentially high-risk behaviours. Thanks, Lucas. We'll go on to look at slide 4. So principles are important to provide us with a North Star for consistent service delivery and model fidelity. And model fidelity, yes, it's critical to ensuring people receive the best evidence-based response in a particular program so they can escape the cycle of chronic homelessness. However, no amount of model fidelity in a standalone response can end homelessness if the surrounding service system is unable to intervene earlier and prevent homelessness and entrenchment from occurring. In fact, worst case scenario is that Housing First could become an expensive band-aid that only catches people at the end of a pipeline of trauma, and none of us want that. So this diagram was developed by Housing First trainer Leah Watkins over in Western Australia, and it beautifully illustrates the interplay and importance of considering Housing First across levels of practice, model and system. So embedding Housing First at the practice level is to ensure that in our day-to-day service delivery, we are adhering to the Housing First principles as closely as possible so that people have the best possible chance for sustained housing and recovery. The central circle is considering housing first at the model level. So this is how do we shape the design, commissioning and funding of housing first services so that workers are supported and able to adhere to the principles, and so that we can create rapid access to housing quickly as part of the model structure. Finally, the housing first at the system level. It can operate as a compass to guide system-wide governance and support service system-wide alignment of all sorts of homelessness responses so that everyone and every response is playing its part to improve prevention and early intervention efforts. Okay, so back to slide 5. Thanks, Lucas. So this is where I'm going to hand over to Charlotte so we can all hear the fresh stuff from Europe and the UK. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thanks, Alison. We can go to the slides 6, Lucas. So before I get into my part of the presentation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm meeting from today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respect to their elders past and present and extend my respect to any First Nations people joining us today. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to note, with the conversations we're about to have being centred on housing first approaches in Europe and the UK, that we're not advocating that we're able to transfer unchanged European approaches to the different contexts across Victoria. And I would like to underscore that in line with Manana Wantien Marta Court and the Council to Homeless Persons Aboriginal Cultural Safety Framework for the SHS, that we're interested in our state continuing to further capacity building that contributes to projects that prioritise Aboriginal cultural safety. Thanks, Lucas. This slide here shows what I was able to action thanks to the Jenny Smith Housing First Scholarship. I was able to undertake visits to 9 cities across 5 countries in under 4 weeks. Across the first week, I completed session 3 of the Housing First Europe Hub Train the Trainer program and the accompanying trainers symposium in Hungary. And following this, I was able to have additional conversations and meetings with 44 professionals across 14 organisations. These organisations included housing providers, so tenancy providers, who aim to operate in alignment with Housing First principles. Support providers, similar to the organisation I work for in Victoria. Housing First for youth providers. Housing First researchers and training providers. Housing First and homelessness peak bodies and advocates, and some family violence services who had Housing First teams. The 5 countries I visited were Hungary, Finland, the Netherlands, Scotland, and England. Thanks, Lucas. So one of my key aims during this trip was to increase my capacity to provide training on Housing First across the Victorian SHS and to contribute to Housing First capacity building more broadly. And one avenue to increasing this capacity was to increase my exposure to Housing First practice. Through the conversations I was fortunate to have with people who have worked in Housing First programs, there were some key practice highlights that I'll share. Recurring themes of housing as a human right struck me across this trip. In some settings, it came through as an ethical aim, and in others, it was legislative. The presence of social housing across some of the countries I visited far outweighs the proportion of social housing here in Victoria, with some countries having over 20% of their housing stock categorised as social housing, while reports from 2021 showed social housing making up less than 3% of Victoria's housing stock. And I'll note here that this Homelessness Week, Homelessness Australia called for the changes that will have the biggest impact, including increasing social housing to 10% of all housing. Low caseloads were a recurring theme in Housing First teams as well, and the capacity and resources to work with people from a person-centred approach with creativity for lengthy periods of time. Another key highlight was the presence of lived and living experience of homelessness amongst people who worked in the sector, both in identified roles and general roles. And as we know, richness to our sector is brought by the lived and living expertise of those who have accessed specialist homelessness services or who have experienced homelessness. Some other points regarding practice that might be of interest is that some Housing First programs had an out-of-hours team who were able to respond to Housing First participants beyond standard business hours. Other teams did not. Some Housing First programs provided support after an offer of housing was made. Others, the offer of housing was embedded in the program, and for some, support did not necessarily come with rapid housing due to system restraints, but support was still intensive, flexible, and extensive. Some programs had capacity for floating support, which meant support could continue with a person across multiple tenancies or across short periods of homelessness, whereas other programs, their support would cease if the person was to leave their tenancy. Some teams were multidisciplinary and others had multiple staff in the one type of role. The differences amongst the Housing First programs that I heard from brings up the question that is in many Housing First spaces, which is one of fidelity, which Alison spoke to at the start of this webinar. And fidelity is something that I'll come back to later, but we know that Housing First fidelity could be a many hours long webinar on its own. So go to the next slide, Lucas. Since being back and processing the conversations and content I experienced through this trip, my current reflection is that there were 9 key themes that came up across this trip. And these themes are on the slide here. So the power of shared language and shared purpose, the impact of societal agreements and expectation for action, the core pieces of the puzzle, which are training, lived and living expertise, and maintenance of practice wisdom, the presence and importance of fidelity and innovation, benefits of support providers and housing providers working together, but of course being functionally separate, the importance of reducing system-wide barriers, or the idea of systems change, the opportunity for sector development and sustainability, the logic and the importance of efficiency, and finally, that to be trauma-informed is to use Housing First. So I'll go through these themes in connection to the scholarship over the next 3 slides. The idea of shared language and shared purpose was particularly evident during the Housing First Train the Trainer and Trainer Symposium. Across the 2 events, there were 32 participants from about 15 different countries, all coming together to learn and grow in providing training on Housing First. Although there were different barriers and opportunities across local contexts, the shared language of Housing First and the principles supported the shared purpose of ending homelessness and supporting people who have an experience of chronic homelessness with multiple and complex support needs. Further into the trip, whilst I was in the Netherlands, the impact of shared language and shared purpose was also evident. I met with service providers, trainers, and advocates, and I learned about the history of Housing First in the Netherlands, starting in around 2006-2007, with a pilot inspired by the work in New York, which has since grown to a systems change perspective nationally in the Netherlands. Changing hearts and minds here appeared to have been a core theme in their approach to systems change, with priority placed on increasing buy-in from local governments and local community, and sustaining support for Housing First approaches. Inspiration and moving on a shared journey with international counterparts also appeared to be a core driver towards maintaining momentum in Housing First in the Netherlands. And they spoke with me about a particular trip that was undertaken to Madrid with people who were invited on the journey of Housing First. They advised me that their minister had signed the Lisbon Declaration and that they even had a National Housing First Day in the Netherlands, which I thought was quite exciting. Their push for systems change appeared to be a rapidly growing area, with the aim to end homelessness by 2030 by focusing heavily on prevention and housing, being outlined in their Dutch National Action Plan on Homelessness Housing First, which has 6 guiding principles as a compass. Conversations here had me reflecting on the power of shared language and shared purpose, the consistency of how Housing First is understood within the sector, but also within everyday society, was strong amongst many of the cities and countries I visited. This had me considering the opportunity within Victoria to lift the brand recognition of Housing First, to show that if someone has been assessed as requiring an individualised Housing First response, then it has been assessed that they have had an experience of chronic homelessness and have multiple complex support needs, which requires a specific evidence-based response. A challenge arises when language or terms are used but are not fully understood. And housing first approaches are at risk of being watered down when the term is used without an understanding of how drastically but purposefully different a housing first approach is from treatment as usual or business as usual approaches. The next theme on this slide here is social agreement and expectation for action. In Australia, the housing first principle, people have a right to a home, highlights the importance of immediate access to a permanent self-contained home which meets people's cultural and social needs. One of the places that this principle was continually reinforced was Finland. There appeared to be a shared understanding that housing is a human right and that it is everyone's responsibility to ensure there are not people experiencing homelessness in their community. In the conversations with professionals I met with in Helsinki, we spoke about the fact that homelessness in Finland is steadily decreasing and that their aim is to end long-term homelessness by the end of 2027. Further, they aim to end all homelessness in the city of Helsinki by 2025, which they explained to me would functionally mean there would be no more than 100 people in crisis accommodation at any given time, and that those people would be provided housing within a month. Hearing about this aim reminded me of the value of high aspirations and bold goals to work towards. Seeing where Finland are now in their approach to ending homelessness is more wholly impressive if you know where they've come from. They shared with me some of the recent history of homelessness in Finland, and that prior to the societal and system shift that resulted in a drastic reduction in homelessness, they saw very high rates of premature death of people rough sleeping, particularly during the winter months. I was informed of an influential minister in 2007 who drastically contributed to changing the hearts and minds of people in Finland to support this principle of people having a right to a home, and that their development of housing first was different from that in the US, which they explained to me has almost resulted in a type of convergent evolution for the international understanding of housing first. Now, many members of the public are not familiar with the version of Helsinki or Finland that had encampments or higher rates of shelters and homelessness. But they explained to me that maintaining their momentum in holding the societal value of housing as a human right is a continual focus. This theme, last theme on the slide here, training, living expertise and practice wisdom, came through as 3 pillars of the maintenance and distribution of housing first knowledge and effectiveness. So training on housing first implementation at the practice, model and systems level was definitely a running theme. In the French context, there was a structured approach to training co-design and co-delivery that was shared with me, where one social worker, one researcher, one expert of lived experience, and one trainer are tasked to co-design a training program on housing first, with their contributions being equally prioritised in this co-design. The training was then co-delivered with the social worker, the researcher, the expert of lived experience, and the professional trainer, all presenting on the training together. I was struck by the organisations that appeared to be more advanced in prioritising lived and living experience in training, program design, and advocacy. And one example was a program that shared with me that 50% of their staff were people with lived and living experience of homelessness. And another team which ran me through their multidisciplinary team structure, which included peer worker roles. Another resounding takeaway was that research and training in this area is strengthened when it is intrinsically connected to practice. And one organisation's training centre was staffed by workers who maintained part-time service delivery work and part-time work within the training centre. Functions such as these utilise the valuable resource of practice wisdom to increase capacity building beyond the individual worker and contributes to transmitting best practice approaches that are current and live within the structured evidence base of Housing First. So I'll just pause here, Alison.
Thanks, Charlotte. Give you a breather, have a drink. That's fascinating stuff so far. It's really interesting to reflect, I guess, that model fidelity really is a mixed bag, but that just serves to remind us that a systemic change journey is always unique It's always context dependent, and yeah, it'll never be smooth or linear. It's about, I guess, you know, pulling several different levers all at once, according to where you have a chance to do so. Really interesting to see the power of mental models and shared understandings. I find the power of shared language and purpose so compelling. And I do think that's where principles, guidelines, and practice frameworks are so important to have in place and to revise regularly, and check for adherence and understanding as generational changes happen in workforces and so forth. And what also struck me is the level of integration you saw between frontline service delivery, lived and living experience, and evidence from research and evaluation. That just seems like a very live interplay there, particularly in Finland, which is fabulous. And I guess that all contributes to important feedback loops for evidence and understanding and uptake of the Housing First approach. And I guess it makes me reflect on the Victorian context. Functions such as the Learning Hub here at CHP, the Housing First Train the Trainer program nationally, communities of practice as an adjunct to training offerings, and of course the invaluable asset of the PEST program here come to mind. And it makes me wonder, what are the ways in which we can bring these elements closer together in a more dynamic way, and in doing so, you know, amplify their impact. And I know we've recently connected the Housing First trainers in Victoria with the homelessness networkers. We did a 4-session systems training together, and that was fabulous just from a networking and knowledge point of view, but it also underlined to us how systems are incredibly resilient and resistant to change. And so this issue of maintaining momentum around shared purpose is a really key challenge. So thanks, Charlotte. Continue on.
Thanks, Alison. That's right. The 3 themes came from conversations I was lucky to have across the trip, but have already been very applicable to the types of conversations we're having here in Victoria more recently. I'll move to the next slide, Lucas. Thank you. So to start with the theme, fidelity and innovation, I'll bring forward a reflection that came from my visits to the Netherlands and Scotland in particular. I was reflecting on the Australian Housing First principle, active engagement without coercion, where the onus is on the workers to maintain the relationship and employ creative and imaginative approaches to ensure their work is engaging rather than blaming people for disengaging. Prioritising this principle was clear during my visit in the Netherlands and Scotland, where people I met with spoke about the importance of staying true to the principles and the method of Housing First, but then using that as a foundation to have out-of-the-box thinking that will drive creativity and capacity for practitioners to work with individuals in ways that work for them, so to be person-centred. In the Netherlands, the theme of innovation was just resounding, with creativity at the forefront of Housing First practice and training. In Scotland, I was fortunate to connect with providers of Housing First for Youth programs and to learn about the purposeful adaptations to person-centred approaches of Housing First when working with young people. Both these countries' strong Housing First literacy appeared to support their capacity for innovation due to the shared language and shared purpose that was well established in line with Housing First fidelity. Another area that the importance of prioritising fidelity and innovation was evident through the conversations I was fortunate to have with organisations with a gendered Housing First program and organisations that embedded Housing First response within specialist family violence services. At the time of undertaking this scholarship, I was in a leadership position within a women's-specific homelessness outreach team, and visiting these services showed me examples of how services can be designed to fit the individual rather than individuals being required to fit the service, particularly through deep understanding of intersectionality and, in this instance, intersectional feminist approaches. These visits also highlighted for me strong potential within the Victorian context to create stronger partnerships between Housing First programs and specialist family violence programs. Through my own practice experience, a significant barrier to linking a woman to support who is a victim survivor of family violence and also has experienced chronic homelessness and has multiple complex support needs is that our homelessness service may have the capacity to employ active engagement approaches, but specialist family violence teams may not in some circumstances. What we then see happening is women falling through the gaps and being underserviced in the area of family violence support due to these specialised programs needing to close due to disengagement and other pressures. The experience of homelessness and of family violence for women is often intricately intertwined, and I could clearly see the logic of merging expertise of services in this way during the length of my trip. Some of the takeaway points from these conversations were around the intensity of the support available to women and their family, meaning women could receive visits every day if they needed, particularly when moving home. The acknowledgement of potential lack of trust that could predate the woman's contact with the Housing First team and the family violence team. And that choice and control is important in making a house feel like a home from the start, creating a foundation to support a woman and her children to have a strong tenancy. This second theme here, support providers and housing providers being at the same table, I wanted to note a reappearing thread of where purposeful collaboration appeared to have really beneficial results. So I'll start by just noting that collaboration internationally seemed to encourage a type of friendly competition amongst service providers, amongst tenancy providers, advocacy groups, and potentially even amongst governments. Not only were they lifting each other up, but they were calling on each other to do more and leading the way by example and sharing resources and information. And then collaboration locally between support providers and housing providers was particularly evident during the visit that I had in the Netherlands, where Housing First advocacy appeared to be accessible by and in connection with not only service providers, but also housing providers. And Finland was, of course, another place where the benefit of this in systemically reducing homelessness was really prevalent, where one of the country's biggest advocates and experts on Housing First is in fact a housing provider. In Victoria, we have incredible opportunities to upskill the workforce of social housing providers with the Australian Housing First principles, an opportunity Victoria has taken some leads in and have further capacity to do. In supporting housing providers to upskill their workforce with Housing First principles, the outcomes for tenants and effective collaboration with support providers should improve. In Victoria, I feel we can see areas where the structured evidence-based approach of Housing First and the associated real-life outcomes supports staffing retention within the support workforce. And I'm hopeful that with increased understanding and collaboration around Housing First approaches, this benefit of around staffing retention could be extended to the social housing workforce as well, which would hopefully contribute to advanced and specialised responses to tenancies. People should also be able to maintain, this is a note that I made sure I put in, that people should of course be able to maintain their tenancies without any additional requirements to maintain support like anyone else in the private housing market. So support providers and housing providers working together, but being functionally separate. And the last theme on this slide, reducing system-wide barriers. I'll speak to reflections that came from conversations with and about the UK-based leaders in policy positions, campaigning and research, and the developers of the Housing First Principles for England, which is Homeless Link. Housing First programs in England have grown from about 5 programs in 2010 to now about 150 Housing First programs, serving around 3,000 people across England, which was growth that I was really impressed by. Some of the key frameworks they have to support national approaches to Housing First include the Homeless Link Housing First non-negotiables and fidelity assurance frameworks. And they do also have practice level frameworks, which were really interesting, such as guidance for practitioners on how to manage transitions when participants are graduating from Housing First programs. These conversations highlighted that principles such as flexible support for as long as is needed not only supports tenancy sustainment, but brings positive outcomes in other areas that a Housing First participant may be engaged with, such as justice, health, and social care. The resources I've mentioned here from Homeless Link are available on the Homeless Link website. And lastly, on this point, in visiting Housing First for Youth programs in Scotland, I was also introduced to the idea of Housing First being an approach of prevention and resolution when considering system-wide approaches to ending youth homelessness. It was reflected that Housing First for Youth is a system-wide prevention approach. And in the Victorian context, upskilling and resourcing capacity for Housing First for Youth approaches is a key opportunity, not just for response, but for prevention.
Thanks,
Alison.
Charlotte. Do you want to take another breather? Just a quick reflection on, the strength of and the sense of innovation that's at play in Europe. It's really fascinating, and it just highlights that there needs to be a capacity in the way that we implement programs that, service providers are encouraged to take risks, be creative, and to inculcate a bit of a safe to fail approach, or even experimentation, because this is a client cohort for whom most other interventions have been shown to fail. So the stronger partnerships between Housing First and family violence, really fascinating and probably long overdue as well. And really ripe for cross-pollination there. So, and also found really interesting, Victoria is traditionally, it's been a support-led homelessness sector, but Charlotte, you're talking about the primacy of housing providers in advancing the Housing First agenda. And I think, again, that's a really fascinating reflection on the position of the discourse in Victoria, really, and how we can take it forward a little more strongly in a housing-led way. And of course, Housing First for Youth holds enormous potential to cut off that pipeline of supply. We don't want customers coming to the Housing First door for forevermore. We really need to turn the ship around and start acting preventatively. So thanks, Charlotte. So heading through the last of your three themes, home straight.
Thanks, Alison. Okay, so this theme here, sector development and sector sustainability, came from the clear pathways for sector development that Housing First training and implementation provides, but also the career contentment that appeared to come from workers within Housing First programs being able to enact their values alongside their practice. The way Housing First staff were able to speak to the logic and outcomes of their work gave the impression of strong job satisfaction. And the frameworks and guidelines produced by many of the organisations and peaks support sector development and promote best practice in a way that is accessible to the workforce. Supporting the maintenance of practice wisdom within the SHS can be a significant challenge for a sector who can see workers coming in and out. But the maintenance of practice wisdom is at times key in supporting the best outcomes for people who access our services. The end to short-term contracted programs often cause significant loss of practice wisdom from the sector and does not support the Housing First principle, flexible support for as long as is needed, which of course is ongoing food for thought for our sector. Some Housing First staff explained to me that despite contract arrangements for their own programs, they operated with the belief that their program would continue to be funded. And conversations about participants of Housing First programs held true to strength-based approaches, where staff referred to participants who had graduated from the Housing First program rather than being closed or exited. They spoke about the structure of their program never wanting to have targets for graduating participants, and that instead, if the funding body wanted more people to receive support from Housing First, then they would need to fund more programs. So providing clear frameworks and guides and preserving practice wisdom appeared to be two of the key protective factors for the specialist homelessness system in many of the places that I visited. This next theme, to use Housing First is to be efficient. I kept coming back to this and just the general idea of efficiency across the length of the trip. And the idea that when it comes to someone who is eligible for a Housing First response, the sector in Victoria is already providing support for as long as is needed. It's just being provided in an inefficient way when it comes to addressing homelessness. This support is being provided through calls to ambulance services, is being provided through repeat presentations to emergency department and to repeat presentations to crisis service front doors. It's being provided ineffectively through incarceration. It's being provided through multiple short-term case management support periods amongst multiple different organisations. And it's being provided through lengthy hospital stays due to the serious health implications of chronic homelessness. So in summary, to use a housing first approach is to be efficient. And this appeared to be clearly understood in the places I visited. And this last theme here, to be trauma-informed, is to use housing first. And I'll place this within the context of conversations where trauma-informed care and housing first approaches overlapped across the trip. So during the Trainer Symposium, a presentation on trauma-informed care explored the ways in which trauma can cause changes in brain structure and functioning that can affect future development when the brain is still growing, and other ways that childhood or early life trauma can impact a person across their lifetime. Visiting Housing First for Youth providers in Finland, the Netherlands, and Scotland, I was really struck by how Housing First for Youth can not only be a preventative approach to homelessness, but can hopefully be a preventative approach in reducing a young person's exposure to trauma. The Housing First principle aligns seamlessly with trauma-informed care principles. Providing rapid housing supports people's capacity to regain physical control of their environment and capacity to access physical and psychological safety. Active engagement without coercion promotes boundaried, safe rapport building, where our worker enacts deep listening, person-centered approaches, and building trust by doing what they say they're going to do and having the capacity to do what they say they're going to do. Further, the increased capacity for recovery and social and community inclusion was really evident, particularly while I was in Finland, where employment opportunities, social engagement, and contribution to community were clearly connected to the increased capacity for a person to have a home of their own in Helsinki. And this trip left me with the firm belief that to be trauma-informed when working with people who have a chronic experience of homelessness and who have complex support needs is to use a housing first approach. And beyond that, to be trauma-informed when working with young people at risk of or experiencing homelessness is to use a housing first for youth approach.
Fantastic, Charlotte. The words that I heard loud and clear were career contentment, job satisfaction, preserving practice wisdom. And housing first is to be efficient, and to use housing first it's trauma-informed care. So in a sense, the housing first principles are there for any homelessness service to do their best to move closer to, adhere to, emulate, aim for. Yeah, that's tremendous. Before we finish up, Charlotte, you've mentioned a few reflections for Victoria so far, but I'm just wondering if you've got any final thoughts grounded in what we can learn as a sector, but also, is there anything that you think other parts of the world can learn from us?
Thanks, Alison. I'm not sure if we have the slide on this one, but I'll yeah, just in closing, learnings from Australia. So a lens of continual improvement, critical reflection, and analysis of alignment with high fidelity housing first were definitely present in the conversations that I had internationally. However, the people I spoke with also appeared to be justifiably really proud of the progress that has been made and maintained in the aim of ending homelessness. In Victoria, similarly, learning from the international and local evidence base about the benefits and effectiveness of housing first means using a lens of critical reflection of our own challenges, but also not losing sight of the gains we too have made. And the importance of recognizing strengths is to not lose momentum or to deprioritize areas that are supporting the pathway towards ending homelessness. So through the conversations that I had internationally, some people were quite envious of the presence of lived and living experience, expertise, and advocacy that we do have in Victoria, particularly through the Council to Homeless Persons PESP program. Local programs like Journey to Social Inclusion, Melbourne Street to Home, and Homelessness to a Home were also areas of intrigue for the people that I spoke with. And the big build and increase to new social housing properties that we're currently seeing in some corners of Victoria were also an area of envy in some of the locations where the development of new housing is incredibly rare. I do feel that regarding fidelity, we have opportunities in Victoria to increase housing first literacy to ensure we're on the same page and that we're talking about the same thing when we're using the term housing first. But overall, I was struck by the sheer opportunity present within Victoria and the number of barriers internationally that we may not necessarily be faced with here. And when I'm feeling hopeful, I'm inspired by the boldness of language that we're using locally to end homelessness, that is, to make the experience of homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. Not only is this possible, but the compass is already available to us. So to use a housing first approach is to be efficient, to use a housing first approach is to be trauma informed, and to use the housing first approach is to have a system that no longer aims to maintain homelessness, but that aims to end it. Thanks, Alison.
Fantastic, Charlotte. Thank you so much. That was just a fascinating and really thought-provoking window into your experiences as a 2023 Jenny Smith Scholar. It's also fantastic that you're an accredited Housing First trainer and you're available with others to share your knowledge across the sector as we work to implement more responses that are housing-led and hopefully moving closer to high fidelity in Housing First wherever we can. If people on the call would like to know more about any aspect of Charlotte's presentation, Housing First in general, or to request training from our contingent of excellent Housing First trainers, including Charlotte, you can certainly contact CHP, and you can also contact an email address at Homelessness Australia directly, which Lucas will put in the chat for you. So look, finally, I'd just like to mention once again, put a plug in for the fact that the Jenny Smith Housing First Scholarship is being offered again in 2024. It's open to senior practitioners who work in Victorian specialist homelessness services and who have the support of their organisation to apply. The 2024 scholarship recipient will receive up to $15,000 towards the cost of overseas travel to jurisdictions that are at the forefront of implementing and innovating Housing First principles, policy and practice. The scholarship aims to enable the recipient to benefit from diverse perspectives and in-person experiences of Housing First that are not readily available here in Australia. You can read detailed information and guidelines on the website, CHP website, but proposals may focus on one or several Housing First related issues. And while we're seeking to attract well-developed proposals, we also understand that additional work may be required after the scholarship's awarded to facilitate or confirm introductions to key people or organisations. So CHP is able to assist, and so are the housing. Charlotte would certainly be able to facilitate some of those introductions if that's required. So yeah, information on the application process is now available on the CHP website. The closing date is 20th of September. So any inquiries can be directed to the email address on the website, and make sure that you put in the subject line that it's regarding the Jenny Smith Housing First Scholarship. So look, with that, I'd like to thank Charlotte once again. That was just so energising to hear all that fabulous information from overseas. And I'd like to close the webinar by thanking everyone who put aside their lunch break to be with us. And we hope this session has enriched your understanding and your aspirations for Housing First services and for systemic change in your local area and indeed Victoria. So thanks again, and wishing you a lovely remainder of your day. Thanks, everyone.